Hey, hey, hey! Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to a new International Comics Crusaders. Pardon the mask, but my cat acted like Starro the other day and fucked me up. To
Wow.
say the least. Yeah, she's
So
lucky
you're
she's
Cat
alive.
from Cat from
You're
hell.
Scarro now. You're
Yeah,
Scarface now.
yeah, Scarlet more like it. It's horrible. So, ladies
Jeez.
and gentlemen, welcome to a new International Comics Crusaders. Yeah, I'm very happy here. We're gonna party here because we got a very controversial topic today.
Oh, we do. We
I love
do.
it. You guys
Mm.
are sick-minded to think about these things behind my back, and you have me researching, getting angry, and remembering my
No,
own experiences. Because I'm like, wow, no, the
no.
arguments are so crazy and
Oh, come on. We've
in
been.
tune, but going on since what 1906 we've had these creator owned or created by issues. Crazy.
No, we've been threatening you with this one for a while. So yeah, it's
And
not
it's
something I think.
going to be very controversial because we are going to kill some sacred cows.
Yeah,
Ooh,
definitely. I mean, I came
yeah.
in what you guys have. I'm gonna go with some personal experiences and some things that I've seen that I find to be a little divisive, within the context of it, I guess. So, all right. So, which one of you two was the mastermind behind this one?
I think we both. Credits! Who should get the credit
Credits,
for this thing?
exactly.
Well,
Here
Bravo.
we go.
I mean, it's funny. Um, I wrote a piece on it about over 10 years ago for on DeviantArt, and it got a lot of people talking about it then. Um, so it's something that keeps coming up, and I think that there's it's not cut and dried. It's not something
No.
that is easily defined, and there's it's almost like there's no two cases the same.
No.
Yeah, and it's. I think
So
it's also quite interesting in how much it runs in the family, in the culture you work in, the company you work for. And I will give you a nice example from Marvel in a minute, where you always think of Stan being the one who says, "Oh no, credit is all mine." I give you an example where it wasn't Stan.
right. I mean, it's interesting because you know, um, you mentioned Stan. I mean, Stan was the one who decided, like, hey, like, more people should get credit. And in comics, it was Stan who
Exactly.
gave us the more fuller, more the credit boxes, and
Hmm.
detailed down to even like the editors. People would start to know the names of editors. So on that front, it's credit, and you can say credit where credit is due. But when it comes to created by, the credit doesn't always go where it's due.
Exactly.
Because it could go so many avenues. It could be the writer, the artist. I mean, I'm looking at articles where even editors are arguing, "Hey, I navigated the culture of the narrative of the character." So
But it's
they're
all.
looking for created by
Well,
credit.
it's like when you see
It's.
go on, Chris.
It also goes. I think it also goes a little bit further. Than I mean, you all know the running joke with the Bob Kane, created by Bob Kane byline, and everything is signed with Bob Kane. I mean, Dave is
Yeah,
just laughing, and I mean,
yeah,
the examples are endless because if you think of Mac Rayboy, who was a very gifted artist in the 1940s, and his publisher had other artists draw in his style, and then he sold it under the name Mac Rayboy because everybody loved this guy's art. So,
mm,
and on the other end of the spectrum, you have this idea of well, Siegel and Schuster created Superman, but who should get credit for all the world that was created around him? I mean, Jerry Siegel, when he
yeah,
came back to DC in the 50s, he created a lot of this backstory in the Superman family. So he was the original creator. But take another character like Spider-Man, all this world around him, including maybe the Punisher and all the characters that came to Peter Parker's life, Should Steve Ditko or should Stan Lee get the credit for this? That's a question. Did they kick it off?
Well, I mean, like in that instance, when you think that, yes, Punisher first appeared in Spider-Man, but it was neither Stan Lee or Steve Ditko who was writing at the time, or
Exactly.
even involved with the book at the time.
Exactly.
So I think it's this thing that I've, it's, is it the character? Is it the world? Is it the concept? The initial idea? Because again, Al, you mentioned like how editors talk about things. Well,
yeah,
sometimes if an editor assigns a creator like, okay, we're rebooting a character, here's the name, here's the old character, but you can kind of do what you like with it. Like the creator goes away and comes up with something, but is the creator because like he's riffing off something else? It may, like a very good example is Sandman. If you look at, Neil Gaiman built this massive world, but he was basically like, he made a pitch for Jack Kirby's Sandman, Jack Kirby and Joe Simon's Sandman.
Exactly.
So again, it's like if he hadn't had that in the first place, where would it have started? Would it have even existed? So yeah, this is it's something that is complex.
It is complex because, Dave, I'm going to give you one of my examples. I was at a convention, Rhode Island Comic Con, a few years ago, and I saw Bob Layton was there, and I took a look at his banner, and his banner says, creator of Iron Man. Now, when I saw that, I'm like, no, you didn't. No, you've added to the mythology of Iron Man, but you are by no means the creator of the Iron Man, maybe of an Iron Man, but
well,
to say that, I mean, just
I can directly give you the opposite example. On Wednesday, we have the first part of my new horror column series, and I did some extensive research, and I already teased that I will be telling you a little bit more about this character Zatanna. You might remember from the Marvel comic days, from the old black and white magazines. She originated in a magazine called Vampire Tales. Remember, you had these black and white Marvel magazines that were outside the comic code. It was basically Marvel looked at what Warren was doing, and they said, well, basically Warren is doing this, and they stole this horror idea and horror comics. They brought them back in full swing outside the comics code in magazines. So Marvel said, well, we want some of that action too, and they also put out plenty of horror magazines. Most ran only 5 issues, 10 issues, but there were plenty of those. There was one magazine called Vampire Tales that came off in 1973. And you had this girl in the issue 2, you had this girl walking down the street in a trench coat with a headscarf on. Everything looked fine and dandy. The street was very menacing. Creep was following her. Creep is about doing his thing, and she turns around and said, do it. And she basically steals his soul and is revealed as the daughter of the devil. Okay, she's dressed in a what looks like leggings, a top, and a trench coat, long hair, looks very beautiful. She's a soul stealer, we get this. Come to issue. It was written by Roy Thomas and drawn by John Romita Sr. We come to the 3rd issue, and something very interesting happens. When you open the issue, she looks completely different. She's in that issue 2. There are some pin-ups. She looks very, very different. Heavy eyeshadow, the hair is different. She's now dressed in a leotard, with lots of cutouts. She wears a crown with horns. Everything looks very different. Everything looks very European. Of course, it figures because the artist now is Esteban Marato from Spain. What is fine and dandy? Jerry Conway is writing the first story. But there's a text piece in that issue. You say, okay, text piece, kind of cool. Either skip it or read it. It's written by a woman. You say, oh, cool, this is a men's club. There's a woman writing this text piece. Fantastic. Look at the name, Carla Joseph. Now, who's Carla Joseph? She's Stanley's secretary. And remember how Stan always had a nickname for everybody. Romita was Jazzy John and the King and so on. The boy. Carla Joseph is cute Carla. That tells you a lot about her standing in that company. And what she basically does, she recreates the scene when Marato's art comes in for the first time. This guy from Spain, and he has completely redesigned Zatanna. She looks completely different. She looks like a European fashion model all of a sudden. And she has, in this text piece, John Romita say to the guys who, oh, look at this, oh, look, this looks fantastic, so much better than John Romita, blah, blah, blah. And in this text piece, she has John Romita say, yeah, that looks cool, but John Romita did it all. He redesigned it completely, and this guy only did what Romita told him. True story or not? This is Marvel throwing a new artist from Spain under the bus.
Yeah.
Interesting, isn't it?
Yeah.
Very insane. How do you feel about that, Dave? I mean, something like that.
I mean, look, you look
happening.
at Esteban Morato's work, and there's no way John Romita told him to draw like that. I mean,
Exactly. I have a very funny line in my column where it basically says, well, basically, the 3 months passed between this issue. So either John Romita went to art school in Europe, trained classical art, and he knew European fashion styles. Well, then basically he did this.
Yeah. Well, he is from New York, right? I mean, as close to Paris as you'll get, fashionably.
Yeah.
No, I mean, look, that 2-pager that he did. I mean, it's probably one of my favorite 2-pages that John Romita's done.
Oh, it features heavily in my column. Trust me.
Yeah.
And also the origin of this, because this is also tied to a larger story. But read my column on Wednesday.
He's teasing, folks. He's teasing here.
That's trouble then.
And a shout out to Doc. He's saying hello out here to everyone on the team.
Shout out.
Hey, man. It's like, I think that the first 2-pager looks so cool because I think, John Romita clearly always likes to draw women. And
sure.
I think this was a chance to draw something much more sexier than he was normally allowed to do in, say, Spider-Man.
Mm-hmm.
But, again, it's like, I don't like to pigeonhole anyone, but just, John Romita doesn't have the range to go where Esteban Morato goes.
Definitely.
If you actually look at the work Esteban Morato did before that, if you look at his Dracula work and the work he's doing in Europe, it's clearly, that's what he lived and breathed. It's like, if you look at the work he did in Warren magazine, clearly, maybe John Romita just said to him, hey, I really like that stuff that you did in Warren magazine. Can you do more of that? So he's trying to take credit for telling Morato to draw like himself.
What is so very interesting? What is so very interesting is that when you look at this pinup I posted of Zatanna with this crown of horns, like a ram, like an Ares. It's quite amazing. She doesn't wear that nowhere in her entire run, except in the issue she's killed off that comes in Marvel Team Up number 81, and you have Mike Fosberg and Steve Laiola doing the art. There they bring it back, which is kind of interesting because time has passed. It's 10 years later almost, and now they can do Zatanna in the way Esteban Morata did her. Isn't that interesting? 10 years later.
Crazy. I want to do something though. Hold on. I want to go back to something you said. John Romita made maybe a suggestion, correct? So think about those 90s tape, with the image creators before they left that Stan Lee did. One of those examples, the one with Rob Liefeld that I watched.
I love this story.
And he's drawing, Stan Lee's basically standing behind that. It's like, we're creating this, right? This is ours, right? But Stan did nothing but stand behind him. I love Rob Liefeld's response. Yes, Stan, yes.
Yeah.
I mean, what is that all about?
That is the attitude. That's the attitude.
Well, that's Stan. I mean, to be honest, I think that's Stan Lee's attitude for everything he ever did at Marvel.
Exactly.
I mean, there's this one of the reasons at least from my perspective, why I wanted to tackle this subject is again, you mentioned editors. There's a lot of editors that just the way they suggest something. So whether, Karen Berger had said to Neil, hey, how about you do Sandman? Or whether he pitched, hey, I want to do a new take on Sandman. It's, you know, you look at Spider-Man. See, that Spider-Man came about not because Stan or anybody asked for, hey, I've got this idea of Spider-Man, a character called Spider-Man, who like let's come up with something around it. It was Joe Simon and Jack Kirby had pitched Stan on a character called Spider-Man, and he just didn't like that character. He just didn't like it. It looked like basically Captain America with a gun instead of a shield. Floppy boots. Yeah,
yes,
I mean,
that's the original story. Yeah,
he shot webbing out of his gun rather than out of his, wrist, and
more like the spider.
Yeah, so, yeah, exactly. The original spider. Well, the spider that I think it was. I'm trying to remember.
Simon Kirby created them, didn't he?
Well, yeah, but no. That actually there was a Siegel or Schuster created. I'm trying to remember which one now. Created a character called the Spider for British comics, and he was a villain. Okay. He started out as a villain. Later on, he became kind of more like an anti-hero. He was this guy called the Spider, and again, he shot webs out of a gun, but he was dressed in all like leathers, very dark-looking costume. Kind of looked like his head-wise, visually, he kind of almost looked like Namor. Like almost pointy, sort of elfin-like ears. But he was this wicked bad guy. But then over the years, became more of a good guy. But he was created by
one of those.
I think it was Siegel. Yeah. I think it was Siegel. If someone watching this can correct me, please ping me.
Hey, Doc.
Ping us. But yeah, it's as far as who created what. So let's just say, if you look at the as Spider-Man is a great example. So okay, we have the name supplied by Simon and Kirby. Stan Lee brings in
teenager idea.
Well, I don't know if he even brought that in. I mean, I think it was like, hey, look, Jack's not quite got it. Let me talk to Steve Ditko, or Steve Ditko might have been in the office, and he's like, oh, Spider-Man, oh, that sounds cool. And so, see, again, there's nothing like.
It's more orchestration. He's a conductor, if you will. Not a creator.
You can make the case and say he's the Steve Jobs of comics.
What, Stan Lee?
Yeah.
I don't know.
I don't think Steve Jobs ever created anything in his life. It's basically putting people in a room and having ideas.
I don't think that was entirely true, and I think that Steve Jobs definitely had a real true vision for what Apple could be, and he definitely was a perfectionist who,
perfectionist.
But I think.
You think Stan didn't have a vision?
No, I don't think he started out with a vision. I think it was an orchestration. Like as the ideas flowed in, he would try knitting them together. And I think it comes from probably compensating for his lack of actual creation of those properties. Like it was wanting to put his stamp on them. And
I think that's very, very much like Steve Jobs. I think, but be that as it may, I mean nobody's the same. But we were talking about these ideas. Another example that ties into the Spider-Man example is who created Vampirella.
Oh yeah, I thought it's pretty much Frank Frazetta.
No, and he didn't even. Here's the interesting story. Vampirella was created by Forrest J. Ackerman.
Okay.
And I kind of thought it was the two of them somehow. I knew Forrest was involved.
And here's the interesting story. That Frazetta cover we all know, that was the second cover. The original cover was by a guy called a French artist named Aslan.
Okay.
He created the iconic bathing suit, not Frank Frazetta. Forrest Ackerman had the idea for a girl from space, which he stole from Mario Bava's Planet of the Vampires, because basically there are no vampires in their movies. There are girls in there. And if Forrest J. Ackerman was a womanizer and he liked pretty girls and said, well, basically, if there are no vampires in that movie, let's put a vampire girl in a comic. Why not? And also all in my column. So here we go. And then basically Jim Bowen liked the idea, but there was no writer around. But he had Tom Sutton. And if you go to the first story, Vampirella is not wearing her iconic costume in that first story. She's wearing basically what Zatanna is wearing in the 4 years later published story by John Romita. It's nearly the same outfit. And he then phoned Aslan and said, well, basically, we have this idea for a vampire girl, do a cover. The cover came in. It's not a bad cover. It's actually quite a good cover. He later published it as a cover for an annual. But he didn't like the cover completely. He liked the costume. He said, well, the costume is selling this character. Doesn't matter if she doesn't wear the costume in the story, but the costume sells it, but the cover doesn't look like. Then he phoned Frank Frazetta. And Frank Frazetta did the second cover for it. So who created Vampirella?
Yeah.
Archie Goodwin, because they stopped after the second issue, which was also written by Archie Goodwin, which is really horrible. And then if you go to the next couple of issues of Vampirella, there are no Vampirella stories in the magazine. It's basically, she's the host of her own book, but she's like Uncle Creepy, only more attractive.
Right.
With issue 8, Archie Goodwin comes in. Archie Goodwin completely builds the character. It's the same what Jerry Conway did after Roy Thomas handed over Zatanna to him. Jerry Conway created the character of Zatanna because there is no character.
Yeah.
In the 4-page of Roy Thomas, there's just a girl. Jerry Conway really mapped out a complete arc for the character. If you go through all these issues, there's a character arc. He didn't finish it because other writers came in, which brings us to another interesting story. But basically, he mapped out the character and the complete character arc for Zatanna. Zatanna has a complete arc. All the stories connect, except for the last one. And it's very interesting. It's a very interesting arc Jerry Conway mapped out there. This Archie Goodwin does the same for Vampirella. He completely, from when he takes over the writing for Vampirella in issue 8, he invents Vampirella. She has bat wings before that. Bat wings go away. She cannot transform anymore. He completely rebuilds the character. He builds the supporting arc, and he builds this cult of chaos as a nemesis. He completely builds a character. Did Archie Goodwin create Vampirella? And then if you think about who is mostly associated with Vampirella, it's not Tom Sutton. It's Jose Gonzalez.
Yeah.
Jose Gonzalez made her immortal.
See, those
so
are all
interesting.
Those are all
who are the creators?
Co-create credits that was
so it's Forrest J. Ackerman who stole an idea from a movie, from an Italian movie, is the creator of Vampirella. That's interesting.
Yeah. No, I mean, you see, that's what makes this subject so interesting. Like you even look at while initially Martin Goodwin gave just let Stan Lee do what he wanted. Very quickly, he started to give him ideas like, "Hey, okay, well, give me a Justice League," and so Stan asked Jack for a Justice League. And so we got the Avengers. So, it's like, there's probably a very good chance that Stan's contribution to the Avengers was A, telling Jack to come up with an idea, and B, probably calling it the Avengers.
Okay, because I have a question here then. Because generally I see writers getting most of the credit when it comes to created by. But you guys show a lot of examples where it's maybe the artist.
Well, I think in those days, I think particularly back in the 60s, those artists like Jack Kirby, Steve Ditko, Jim Steranko, Wally Wood, all these guys came with ideas. And the freedom, there was a certain amount of freedom at Marvel because, obviously, Stan couldn't do everything, so he quickly allowed everyone to just, hey, write the story. Like you can maybe call me up and tell me what you're doing, or you come into the office and tell me what you're doing, and then you go away and draw it, and and then you deliver it, and you know, he might make ask you to make a couple of art corrections, but more than likely he's just going to script it off your notes, and there you go. That's the issue, and that's what he would call writing. Because he wanted to focus on. I mean, this is where Stan's real, if you like, genius comes into play. Is he was a great marketer, promoter. I mean, in fact, the character I most associate with Stan in the Marvel Universe, particularly in the 60s, is actually the ringmaster from the Circus of Crime. It's that person that orchestrates everybody else, but you're the leader, but they're the ones actually doing all the heavy lifting, and you're the one that's kind of controls them all, gives the orders.
Very good example. It's a very good example. But then, if you even go further, what is the genesis of an idea? We said the person who has the idea is the creator. Is that true?
But see,
because Stan said he had the idea, and therefore he's the creator.
Well, but you see, here's the thing. What's the idea? If you're the writer of something and I say to you, okay, I've got this idea. It's 5 characters. It's Thor, Iron Man, Giant Man, Wasp, Hulk, and they're going to be called the Avengers, and they're going to fight. In the first issue, I want them to fight Loki, and it's, they've got to sort of like, come together as a group, and Loki is going to, he tries turning the Hulk bad by tricking him. If I give you that, then I've solidly given you something. I could say to you, it's like, okay, well, we may be creators on this if we go forward. However, if I just say to you, hey, look, we really want something that's a bit like the Justice League. So yeah, see if you can come up with an idea. And then if you come back with the Avengers, should I really be like, I mean, yeah, I've commissioned you to come up with a group book, but is that created by?
That's very interesting. It's a very interesting idea. I mean, even if you go back to influences, where does the idea from something comes from?
Yeah, look, if the Fantastic Four was really Challenges of the Unknown, if Stan just said, hey, Jack, give us I love Challenges of the Unknown. Can you give me a Challenge of the Unknown? And maybe he said at that time was, hey, give me your version of Challenges of the Unknown with superpowers, and make sure there's a woman in the group.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
that's the Fantastic Four.
Yeah, it is the Fantastic Four. But it's if Jack comes back with, here's Mr. Fantastic, here's the Human Torch, here's the Thing, here's the Invisible Girl, here's Dr. Doom, here's Mole Man, here's the Monster Island. Is the created by equal?
But I think if this is true, and I mean, it's very hard to say after so many years, but the way I always read it, this is my take. Your take might be very different. I mean, not yours, but the audience. Interesting discussion. The way I see it is, it's all that. It's basically Stan saying, well, basically, we need a superhero team. Let's tie together what we already have. We have these monster comics, we have science fiction. Let's make that into a new version, put some superpowers in there, make that into a new version of the Challenges of the Unknown with superpowers, and put a girl in who looks like my wife, basically. But what he also did, and I think this is very interesting, if that's true, is that through his dialogue, he created something that was very unusual at that time. Namely, the idea that these characters didn't like their superpowers, that they perceived themselves as freaks. And with that, we also see that even stronger in Spider-Man, which I think is something Ditko put in there, but it also gelled with Steve's idea. You see these broken characters who don't want to be superheroes. Hey, it would be cool if I had superpowers. You see Peter Parker, he has superpowers now, he has still the same problems, if not more. And I think in that he tapped very much into the zeitgeist of the baby boomer generation. And I think that made Marvel so interesting.
See, it depends on whether that was his idea.
Exactly. I'm not sure. We don't know. We can't know.
Well, all you can tell is when Steve Ditko left Spider-Man, it was part of disagreements with Stan. And one of the things that Stan had wanted to do was he wanted Peter Parker to grow up and go to college. And Steve was like, no, he's not. Steve saw it as, we're always going to tell Peter Parker is always going to be at high school. He's always going to be the kid who's struggling. He's always going to be problems. Whereas Stan, particularly after going to college, he was doing college lectures at the time, talking to college students, and thought, hey, these guys really would like to see him get a bit older. So
exactly.
So under Stan and John Romita, Peter Parker went from being the gangly, awkward Peter Parker Spider-Man to basically Archie. He was Archie with a scooter. The glasses were gone. He was looking handsome. He was looking cute. He's going to nightclubs with both MJ and Gwen.
Got two girls, a blonde and a redhead.
Exactly.
Yeah. So it was basically just he ripped off Archie comics, and
he was, and we should recall that Archie was in the top 10 selling books. So he was doing something very, very. He was leading into something very, very successful at that time. It's very hard to believe, but Archie was selling gangbusters in those days. But I think what Stan was doing, he was writing to a different audience, and that was always Stan. He had this. He had this idea of sophistication. He wanted to be an American writer. That's why he gave himself the name Stan Lee, because I said, well, I don't want to waste my real name on comic books. And I think what he did there was basically looking for an older audience. And that kind of made sense.
Well, it does. But I also think that, see, when I go back and I read a lot of comics from the 60s, I always like the fact that the comics were almost able to exist very successfully on two levels. You could literally read them without the words. Like, you could go through them, flick through them, and you know what the story was. Like, you knew who the characters were, and reading is like, you could read like 2 or 3 word balloons on every spread, and you know exactly what's happening. But when you went and read through it again, it's almost like Stan was writing, so like, okay, well, the younger audience is going to get the pictures, they're going to get the story, they're going to be able to read it fine. I just want to push the dialogue up a little bit to appeal more to the older high school, young college reader. And I actually think that worked well. I actually, I look back at them and it did. It you can see, and I think that when people talk about all ages comics, I think that that magical little pocket in that time period when anybody, like, you could give it to a 6-year-old, he could read Spider-Man and get it. But there'd be bits of it that it would take someone at high school or college to actually quite get. There'd be jokes or comments that a young kid wouldn't get, but he wouldn't care. He was just skimmed straight over it. He's like, he gets what he needs out of it. He sees the fight. He fights,
Stan actually confirmed this, because he said he wouldn't shy away from putting a $10 word in there. And if a kid was too young to understand it, he wanted the kid to look it up in a dictionary.
Yeah.
And that actually makes total sense.
But again, it was pushing your audience up. And but again, what I think, which was a long-term mistake that both Marvel and DC made, was they kept pushing up, and what that did was eventually that left no new audience coming in. Like, if you put
it gets you straight to Joe Quesada, where he broke up the marriage of Peter Parker for that reason, because he said he needed Peter Parker to be single again.
Yeah. Well, at that point, I think that's kind of also admitting that you're creatively dead because you can't come up with something to replace Spider-Man. So you need Spider-Man to go back in time.
Exactly.
I need to reboot.
Yeah, you need to reset, you know, and it's kind of
but which is also then again, where are the? I mean, going back to this time, to the 60s and 70s, there was so much creative energy flowing around. I mean, they were basically creating new characters a day. Why don't we see new characters like that today? Why is it so hard to come up with new characters?
Well, it was very few people would come up with characters every day. You know, Marvel just were lucky. They literally got Jack Kirby at just the right time when he was, I mean, if you see the change in the first 5 years of Marvel from when, like, you look at Fantastic Four #1 and then you got to 50, you realize like such an amazing change, dynamic change there. And I think it was because, I personally think it was because in those 5 years, Jack probably had way more control, creative control, than he'd ever had anywhere before.
Because Stan didn't have the time, so he basically said, "Well, basically, you do it. I dialogue it when it's done."
Yeah, he played in a vacuum, and I think it was only after the mid '60s that when Jack started to go, well, look, I want to do more with these characters. I mean, again, I think a big difference between Jack Kirby and Steve Ditko is Steve Ditko wanted to keep Spider-Man exactly where he was, whereas I think Jack Kirby actually wanted to see his characters grow. And
there's also precedent. If you look at the first 38 issues of The Amazing Spider-Man, all the villains outside of Kingpin, and maybe the Shocker, well, basically definitely the Shocker, all the villains were created by Steve Ditko.
Okay, I have a question here. Right?
Yeah.
My question here is this. So we have the artist that creates the visual representation of the character, but then the writer creates the personality, the attitude. So why is that not given the same strength as the visual representation?
Well, it depends what comes first. I mean,
but like you said, for example, Stan Lee's saying, "Let's form an Avengers team." Also just because he put it together, for example, is that not an idea?
But also very often you have the artist who is a storyteller, a visual storyteller, but also a storyteller.
Not denying their skill, but I'm saying when it comes to the personality that's obtained through reading the words, is that not created by, like, what holds more important, is the visual or the essence of the character through the words?
Let me go back to the most unlikeliest example, because I've just noticed this and I was just writing about this. If you go back again to Vampirella, if you go to the first issue, what Sutton does is basically what Ackerman told him to do. It's basically, his art looks very Hollywood. He draws the sexy girl in a tight outfit, basically. She looks like a Hollywood character, basically, with minus any type of personalities. She's only there to be looked at. When Archie Goodwin comes in, he draws a completely different. The outfit has texture. It's not only painted on. She has a very different look in her eyes. So basically, is a Sutton doing this basically after Goodwin told him, okay, she's not going to be just a sex kitten, we want to do something with her. Her face in the visual representations talks about her personality. It's in the visual representation also.
Okay.
I find that quite amazing.
True.
No, I mean, what I was going to briefly touch on is when I wrote a piece on DeviantArt, which talked about, from the perspective of, you have a writer he's writing, he's coming up with the whole idea himself. It's not an editor, he hasn't been commissioned, he's coming up with an idea, and he's put together a couple of pages, but he's already thinking about the look, and he's got a couple of ideas, but he reaches out to an artist friend of his who he thinks might also be a good artist for it. And so he sends him what he's got and says, like, come up with, can you come up with some visuals? That artist comes up with some visuals that's totally unlike what the writer was thinking, but on seeing them is like, oh my God, that's fantastic. It's like better than what I was thinking. And the artist has put maybe weapons or sort of items on the costume that makes the writer think of different things, different ideas. And he suggests things to the artist, and the artist sends something back, and then they have a conversation. And at that point, the artist is going, "Oh yeah, what if he did this? And he could do this." And the writer's going, "Yeah, actually, that's a cool idea. Yeah, I'm gonna use that." To me, when you talk about sort of created by, it's when you have an instance of, it's usually two people. It's not always. I mean, sometimes it's a single vision from a single creator, but
when it's two people, who comes first? Because
well,
there's
it's
an
not a case of
example. No, I do want to represent. There is an example
there is
because,
examples, but I'm
like
just
in the Age of Heroes, DC actually began showing the created by credit and trying to make it as a standard within their network. So in that example of Damage, storytellers, Tony Daniel, Robert Venditti. But when it comes to the created by Robert Venditti, then Tony Daniel.
It might just
because
be purely
more or less this,
well, it might
maybe
just
the
be
standard, put the writer
artist.
first.
Yeah,
we put the writer first. I think that's the standard now.
Yeah, and it's particularly if it's the writer, if the writer came up with the initial idea.
That's what I'm saying then. So at least even in the placement of created by the person, he had to go first.
But look at how movies do it. I mean, a movie is mostly the vision of a director. He comes last in the credits.
Really though, because there is an example. In 1999, there was a TV show called Harsh Realm based on a Harris Comics property. However, Harris Comics thought they had free reign on the property, licensed the property. A person named Chris Carter did a show based on the comic and said, created by Chris Carter. Here comes James Hartnell and Andrew Paquette that said, wait a minute, we created this shit. So it took some time, they sued, and then it happened that the court ruled in favor of the creators that if it is a property that comes from comics, the judge said it needs to stay inspired by credit and directly following whoever the producer is, in this example, Chris Carter.
Well, I was going to bring up
we talked about TV is very different, and we talked about this.
Yeah,
on the Daredevil show, you have the credits created by, what's that guy who did Cabin in the Woods, created by this guy. And no, of course not, but it's a TV show. We talked about this.
If you look at all the Netflix Marvel shows, whoever was the showrunner for each of those, they get the created by credit. And then at the end titles, or occasionally in the beginning, but usually it's the end titles, it goes based on the material produced by these artists.
And that's what's wrong, because it's supposed to be directly after the producer, not at the end. In this thing, if that's happening now, that's illegal.
But hang on, let's go to Daredevil, and you have the Daredevil show opening with created by Stan Lee and Bill Everett, because they created the character. All that is in the Daredevil show goes back to Frank Miller.
But
Frank Miller's not named anywhere.
I think I'm trying to remember. I can't remember the name of the showrunner for Daredevil, but I think if you go back and watch it, you'll see that he gets created by credit at the beginning of the show.
Exactly.
And actually, as you mentioned, Daredevil, here's something I find interesting, and this is not so much anything I know for a fact, but I'm just basing it on what I know about the creators who worked on it and the time period, who was living in New York at the time. It was, if you look at, so the first issue was Stan Lee, Bill Everett.
By the way, it's Drew Goddard. Drew Goddard.
Oh yeah, that's right. Yeah. But but the cover was drawn by Jack Kirby. If you look at that time period, Jack Kirby was still living in New York. He was a very good friend of Bill Everett's. He'd actually helped Bill Everett through a time when, Bill Everett was an alcoholic by 16.
Exactly.
And they both hang around on the Lower East Side, where there was a lot of boxing gyms. And you know, we knew that Jack had boxed a little bit during World War II, and Bill Everett's father did. So I personally, and this is just a feeling from what I've seen from the time, how much Jack Kirby had to do with the beginnings of Marvel, I would say that the concept and the story behind the origin for Daredevils was Bill Everett's and Jack Kirby's, and that it was maybe Jack even helped do some very, very rough layouts for Bill. But I really think that Jack was instrumental in the beginnings of Daredevil, which he doesn't get credit for.
Jack was instrumental in the whole foundation of the Marvel U.
Oh
period,
yeah.
Definitely.
I mean,
period.
You know, by that period there wasn't actually a bullpen. That bullpen that everyone mentions wasn't actually in existence at that point. It was Jack would come up to the office, be talking over ideas. I'm sure he was in 3 or 4 times a week.
Jack Kirby was the one-man bullpen. He was the starting pitcher, the closer, the reliever.
Well, I mean, it's so obvious. There's lots of covers, layouts for books that Jack did. That where in some instances you can clearly see it in the work, but he doesn't get credit for it.
Of course.
It's also quite interesting that when you once these main Marvel characters got established, they all got much blender. And when you have the 70s with the new creators coming in, like Gerber, like Don McGregor, and so on, they worked on lower tier characters, Captain Marvel and so on, and they got all the freedom because these were not the main characters. And all of a sudden, these second tier books got so much better than the main books. It's quite interesting, isn't it?
Well, I mean, if you look at it, a lot of those second-tier books became the material that everyone started to go to when it came to looking at the movies. You know, I mean, yes. You know, Don McGregor's work was so foundational for what Netflix has done.
Black Panther movie.
Exactly.
Black Panther movie.
Yeah, a lot. Don McGregor we had a pleasure seeing him around in Comic-Con, and while he had a lot to say and a lot of great stories, I hope to have him on this podcast one day.
That would be fantastic.
Because that would blow your mind. But the whole thing is,
absolutely.
ICC will turn into the Don McGregor show because the man is going to talk. And he talks.
He's welcome to come on any time and talk as long as he wants to.
He can talk.
Chris,
he can talk.
You're gonna pull out a pad and take notes for your next column after you hear him.
I'm sure I will.
You know what? I'm gonna talk to Bud from No Prize Podcast because he knows him really good. Had lunch with him, if you will. I'll see if we could help us get him. That'd be fantastic.
If people are not familiar with his work, get the Marvel masterwork Black Panther, or get the Killraven masterwork.
Or if you, I think if you, I was on Comixology just before we came on air. I bought all the Black Panthers, which are all free right now. So
yes,
exactly.
I was going to say that.
Excellent choice. Very, very groundbreaking work.
You know what's crazy though? When I think back to my childhood, Jungle Action was always in my 3-pack of comics when I would go to Grand Book Center. There was always one of those books that was tossed in there. So like unwittingly and unknowingly, when I just think back, like, wow, Black Panther has always been a big part of my life too. The Jungle Action.
It was actually drawn after Rich Buckler left by an African American artist.
Billy Graham.
Yeah, exactly.
Rich Buckler, I had the pleasure of meeting him before he passed, and he was very bitter about his Wikipedia. Yeah, can you have me change it?
I can completely understand that because that's all Jared Ross doing. Because there was this rumor that he traced his art, which is completely nonsense.
No, he wasn't. Listen, at that con, that man was drawing his ass off, and he created, Deathlock, which is the character I like. It was so, I always into the weird characters.
Very, very iconic. But it's also the first time you really see Klaus Jensen shine, also on Jungle Action.
Yes.
But very, very good work.
But Rich Buckler was one of those. Rich Buckler was one of those guys who could clearly, if you said like, oh, we want you to do the Fantastic Four, so can you do it a bit more Kirby-like? Yep, he could do it.
He did it. The same with the Avengers. His work on the Avengers is very, very close to Neil Adams because he wanted to create continuity to Neil Adams, not because.
Well, when you think about it, he was it. I think he started issue 101.
103, I believe. It's right. 101, maybe. I think it's 103.
Yeah, I think Dan Adkins inked him at first. But it was very like it was following on. You know, it was so close to the Neil Adams, John Buscema, and Barry Smith run.
How about that?
Definitely.
Too? I have a question now, and also in a created by type of credit. So yes, an artist may come up with the initial design, but of the look, let's say. But the colorist comes up with the uniform, no? Or are they directed?
Usually, it's the initial artist on the book. Often, might do a color drawing.
What's the percentage there?
In most of the instances I've worked on, at least as far as the rough ideas, like a color palette, at least it comes from the initial artist, and the colorist. Once you actually get underway with it, once you're actually underway on the book, at that point, usually the colorist starts to have more of their own. They put more of their own taste on it.
There are some interesting examples also from the early Marvel days. Allegedly, Ditko wanted Spider-Man's costume to be orange and purple. They changed the orange to red and kept the purple. He has a purple, not a blue costume in the first couple of issues.
Right.
And then they changed it to blue. And the other thing is, of course, we all know this, the Hulk. Because Stan Lee wanted him gray. And the colorist said, or the printer said, well, basically gray, we cannot, it will change. We can't keep it stable. And he said, doesn't matter, we do it anyway. And then he got the first 1 or 2 issues and said, oh, it really looks shit, let's change it to a different color.
Yeah. But we still got the gray hole back and Joe fixed it. Now that's talk and is a Las Vegas thug or an enforcer.
Exactly.
So
exactly.
What's that creation? Is that a new creation or a co-creation or an add-on creation? What is that? What type of credit does that get?
That's interesting. That is interesting.
So let's take this. I was actually having a conversation about writing, screenplay writing with someone just a few days ago, and I was describing to them a conversation I'd had on a flight once with someone who was a script doctor who'd worked on Armageddon, and they'd written quite a substantial rewrite on the film, but they didn't get a credit because so many writers were working on that no one by the time the script was being filmed, most of the writers who'd worked on it hadn't written enough because under the Writers Guild,
exactly, that's an interesting point.
You have to contribute a certain amount to the script that's significantly yours to get a credit. And all
is there a percentage that you are privy to for our listeners?
Oh,
you know what
I think that's basically it's their guild rules and there's arbitration.
I think it's something like 25 to 30%.
Yeah, something like that.
You've got to have a significant. You really have to be a significant part of the project.
And then there's the interesting thing how it's perceived in the media, because I remember this very clearly. It really pisses me off to no end. For me, one of the best X-Men movies is X-Men First Class. I love this movie to pieces.
I agree with you.
Once that movie was very popular, Simon Kinberg ran around and said, well, basically, I wrote this movie. It's so fantastic, and we are going to do more movies. And then he went on to do the next one with Bryan Singer. But a lot of that feel, the 60s feel from the movie comes from Jane Goldman. But Jane Goldman was never really mentioned. And then you saw the next movies. This spirit of the 60s, or this vibe, this coolness, was completely missing because between Singer and Kinberg, they couldn't get it done.
Yeah.
When you got Kingsman, you had Jane Goldman again, and the first Kingsman is really, really good. Actually, the second one sucks, but the first one is really good. And you have the same feeling, the same style in that movie again. So it's Jane Goldman's influence. But in the press, it's Kinberg, because Kinberg was pushing himself to no end.
Well, he was the producer on it as well, so obviously he's going to want more play, and I think a lot of people do that. I mean, like as far as created by, Like I'll bring up the probably one of the most sorest topics in comics is Miracle Man, Marvel Man.
Oh God!
Like, I mean, basically, I mean, it all originates from Captain Marvel.
And there's but there's the interesting kicker, and I also use this example in my new column because it's also very obvious, and it's also there's a second example. I remember this opening, or we all remember this opening of Marvel Man in Warrior #1, where he has this dream, and I remember I could do these kinds of things, and I'm a normal stop now. Well, Chris Claremont, when he wrote Santana, he wrote a very, very similar story that was in '76. And even if you go a little bit closer, I believe in 80 or 81, because Warrior came out in 82, you had this, we all remember this wonderful Fantastic Four story when Byrne was doing this, where the Fantastic Four are ordinary people, and only slowly they realize that they are the Fantastic Four because they are held in a tiny town by a puppet master and Dr. Doom. And there's this scene where they wake up screaming, or Red wakes up screaming, remembers, I had those powers. And Noir took that.
Yeah.
That is the basis for Marvel Man.
Well, I was actually thinking more about the greater scope of it rather than anything like specific story ideas. If you look at, Captain Marvel was published by Fawcett in the US, and you don't hear much about it, but a lot of American comics were printed in black and white in the UK on newsstand, and in just bundled collections. So you might even have Charlton and Marvel comics in the same comic.
Really?
Yeah.
So let me ask you, Dave, when was the first time you saw a color comic? I'm so sorry, bro.
Oh no, I mean no. No, in
I'm
Britain.
joking, bro.
No, in Britain we have color comics, but not in the same way you're used to.
We had it.
No, you had to paint. You had the excellent painted color comics. They were painted, hand painted.
Yeah, well, we had because everything was an anthology book in the UK. Everything, but it was all weekly, so no one could do 30 pages a week. So it was you had these comics where it was usually 32 pages or approximately, but every strip was only like, you had a selection of strips were 2 pages, some were 3 pages. Very rarely would you have 4. A lot of 1 pages. You'd have some comedy stories, you'd have adventure stories, some one-off stories, a couple of continued strips, but you could do continued because it wasn't, you only had to wait till the next week for the next part and the next part. So it worked like that. But the way it worked was the covers, the center spread, and usually a couple of pages either side were in full color, and was beautiful painted color. It wasn't the processed sort of flat color you used to in Marvel comics and DC comics at the time, but beautifully painted color. And even the other black and white pages, they might be sort of gray toned wash, so that it was wash but printed in black and white. Or it might have been a strip that was originally drawn in color, but they were like, oh, okay, let's put this in this comic instead, and we'll do it in halftone in black and white. So that's what British comics, that's at least what I was used to. And the American comics was something different on a different rack, usually a completely different rack. Like we had on what you would think of as the newsstand racks, the flat racks where the comics are on, those were British comics, and American comics were on a spinner rack. I didn't discover those until much later. I was focused mostly on the British comics, but on those racks would also be these black and white collections. So you get to see Steve Ditko, you get to see Captain Atom in black and white.
That would have been dope.
Yeah, you'd see things like Conga in black and white by Steve Ditko. You'd see a lot of the old Marvel and DC, particularly like the Marvel Big Monster stories by Jack Kirby and Steve Ditko in black and white. So it was beautiful. But they'd be in these anthology collections that, again, were timely Marvel, sometimes Charlton Comics, sometimes other publishers' material would be put in there because the publisher was buying reprint rights, and the way it worked then was, as the publisher, I would buy from Marvel their printing plates. So I could keep printing those strips. I could keep reprinting those strips until the plates fell apart. So often,
wait, so you had a lifetime license in a sense?
well, in a sense, as long as I couldn't refilm it. I couldn't make better plates because I could only use the plates they sent. So quite often the same stories would be reprinted every few years. You'd see the same stories start to appear again, but in different selections. They wouldn't print the exact same issue. They'd print that same story, but with other stories. But over periods of time, you could actually see the plates deteriorate. So the early issues would be beautiful, crisp, black and white line work. And then like several years later, you'd have the same story appear again, but it would be broken up. And they literally carried on. They literally stopped publishing when their plates fell apart and they couldn't use anymore.
Wow.
So,
Yeah,
so getting back to my point on Captain Marvel, there was publishers were reprinting all the Captain Marvel stories, and they were incredibly popular in the UK. They were sold gangbusters. So much so that when DC Comics or National stopped Fawcett from publishing them anymore, they were like, it was worth their while to start originating new stories, but they couldn't use Captain Marvel. So they went to a gentleman called Mick Anglo and said, look, we want you to keep doing these stories, but obviously it can't be Captain Marvel. So they just called him Marvel Man instead of Captain Marvel.
Exactly.
And they interestingly enough, they did away with Mary Marvel, and they just had 3 male characters who all said the same word, who all became
Kimota.
Yep, Kimota.
Kimota.
Which is atomic backwards, isn't it crazy?
Yeah, exactly. And they had instead of the wizard, they had there was a scientist from another world, gave them this magic word, and that gave them their superpowers. And they were published for about 10 years. So way more stories were done with Marvel Man than Captain Marvel.
Who then created Marvel Woman? Was she an original creation by Alan Moore? I'm not sure right now.
Yep.
Was she? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. But what they did it ceased publication in early 1960s. And then in the late 1970s, Des Skin, who was the publisher of Warrior magazine, asked Mick Anglo if he could use the character. And to be fair, Mick Anglo, I don't think Mick Anglo was 100% sure he actually had the rights to, because the publisher had come to him to say, could you create this character, carry on stories?
Which led to plenty of lawsuits later on, actually.
Well, it did, but that original publisher, the publisher of the Marvel Man stories, had long gone, completely folded, not in existence anymore. And Mick Anglo said, "Fine, go ahead, do what you want." It was only later on, when he was hard pressed for money, was he approached and was asked to, like, well, if you say that you didn't give permission, then we can get the rights back for you. So he said, "Oh, I never gave permission to do that." And unfortunately for Des, he'd never bothered putting it in writing.
Yeah, that's a big problem.
So it was a verbal one. And in an interview, Mick Anglo said, yes, he gave permission to do it.
But he did.
Yeah, but however, anyway, so Des offered it to Alan. Alan took it up, and Alan collaborated with Gary Leach on it, and the two of them co-created. Now, this is interesting because Alan Moore usually gets credit for it, but at that particular stage in his career, Alan was much more of a collaborator. So he worked very closely with Gary. Gary was very familiar with the character, and Gary was the one who came up with all the science behind the change on how we would change from Mike Moran into Marvel Man.
But there's also the interesting story that when Moore left and the story needed continuation, or it was popular enough. I think it was already when Eclipse had the rights. I don't know. And they asked Grant Morrison. Grant Morrison asked Alan Moore if he were fine, and of course Alan Moore gave the answer we expect from Alan Moore. He said, "No, leave the character alone." And then Morrison went away, and the game continued the stories.
I got a couple of
Alan was done with it. Like Alan did what he wanted to do, and
exactly,
to be honest,
but
Alan felt it was done. Alan felt
exactly. He didn't. Yeah, he concluded it in issue 60,
and it was. I mean, literally nothing. Nothing that was done afterwards actually really added to it.
No. And that's. I think also he told a complete story, and I can see why he feels the same about Watchmen.
Yeah, I mean, it was. And it was only later on that when Alan Moore believed that Mick Anglo genuinely had the rights to it, he assigned all his rights back to Mick Anglo. So as far as he was concerned, it was like, okay, he signed it. Or the only thing he asked for is if his material was collected, he would get a royalty just for the work he did,
which I find also so amazing. We talked about the credit byline, and when Marvel reprinted the Alan Moore stories, eventually it took decades. It says the original writer. He refused to give them permission to his name.
Yeah, it's
interesting.
I brought it up with you guys before, but I was the one working with Gary Leach as well. Who was we nearly got the rights to Marvel Man, but we were outbid by. Well, and the thing was, the person who was acting on Mick Anglo's behalf basically lied to us. Because he'd got Alan Moore to help him. He'd got Alan Moore to sign over his rights, but then what he did was he told Alan that he would never sell it to Marvel. He told us he would never, ever sell it to Marvel. However, he did tell us that he had someone trying to bid on it who was a toy company. And I asked him straight out, is it Marvel? Is it Toy Biz who owned Marvel at the time?
Yes.
And he flat out said, absolutely not. I would never do that to Alan. But he lied.
And absolutely he did do it.
And Alan was also stabbed in the back by someone he knew very, very closely, who blocked us from doing what we were going to do with it.
Oh my God. Can I ask here, man, that just this way, just a little bit, but can you tease what could have been?
Well, what we planned was this. If you go back and reread the original Marvel Man stories as they appeared in Warrior, you can read in there, and if you look at how dense Alan's writing was, and even how tightly packed those panels were on the page, what we were going to do is, working with Gary Leach, we were going to break down those stories so that instead of it all appearing on 7 pages, he'd redraw it so that it worked on literally every one of those episodes was going to be 20 pages. Because, there's some nice splash pages you could have had in there, some double page spreads you could have had in there that you never got the chance to have.
If it decompressed, interesting.
And if you look at some of the scripts, there's like, I remember one panel in particular. There's this panel where there's literally it's the panels like this, and 95% of it is text with a tiny little head at the bottom. Where if you could have broken that down over at least 3 panels and actually sort of. So
emote the character throughout.
You
have that connection,
and it definitely had the room to do that with, particularly in the early run. And as Alan got more comfortable with it, and Alan Davis came on board, it actually worked better at the page.
I agree. I'm a fan of Marvel Man, Miracle Man. I appreciated that, and it's a very complex character. I mean, it's on such a different level than DC, Shazam, Captain Marvel.
The only other major change
crazy.
we were going to do is the way the story was told originally. You've got Dr. Gargunza. So he's the one who says, hey, look, I wrote myself into this as the bad guy. But he was one of the scientists in control. Well, what we were going to do, and I'd spoken to Alan Moore's good friend and sometimes writing partner, Steve Moore. We were going to basically do a backup series simply called The Shed. And The Shed was going to be the place where it was about the scientist who'd actually was the first person to be involved in it, who he put himself in as the one who gave them their powers, the mysterious science, the astrologist or the astrophysicist in this, and who Gargunza actually arranged to have killed. So we would catalog that whole backstory, not from Gargunza's point of view, which was told during Marvel Man, but from the whole actual story. So you could see how Gargunza came into it and how he worked to have that scientist removed, how he killed, and then he took over control.
So basically the Manhattan Project with superheroes.
Yeah.
Very cool.
So that was another part of it. And then the other part of it was we'd started talking to Paul Greengrass to direct a film. And we had reached out and started a conversation with both him and David Goyer to write the first draft of the screenplay. And we had actually a confirmation from investors that if we could get Paul Greengrass and David Goyer attached to the project, they would invest $70 million into turning it into a feature film.
Nice. And it fell apart?
Well, thanks to one individual who knows Alan and is also represented at CA, blocked us, which also meant by blocking us, it went to Marvel, which is what he wanted. So.
Really? So for you, car blockers, a middle finger salute, all right?
Yeah.
But the irony is that it didn't give Marvel much, because they reprinted those stories. They tried to do new stories, reprinted some of the old stories, but they were not really successful because there was no audience.
They haven't integrated the character the right way into the Marvel U. They've done nothing with this character, to be honest. Nothing.
It's not. You see, their approach was all wrong. Their approach was all wrong.
I agree, bro.
They came in and they'd spent a lot of money to get it, and they were decided, right, we're going to get this out of it by milking it for what we can. So it was sort of, you had a few pages of comic, some interviews, some notes and articles and padding, loads of padding for a $5 comic.
Exactly.
And people just like, no, we've read this. Like half the
world, shit.
Yeah, half the world had downloaded the PDFs of the original comics, so they just wanted to have it in print. So they should have just gone straight into hardback books.
Yeah, agree. Oh my God, an omnibus of that stuff.
Absolute edition would have been nice.
Well, all they should have done is they should have done reasonably priced trades of the 3 books, hardbacks of those, and an omnibus of the whole thing, and that's it. And then straight into new material, or
I mean, do you think maybe?
And also, I mean, what is also missing is because what Moore did back then was groundbreaking to a certain degree. And if you read it today, you cannot understand how groundbreaking this was, because it has been done to death since then. You need to re-educate readers about this. Say, this is where it all came from.
But this is what I'm saying then. My thoughts are that I think the creative teams are maybe too hesitant to write new stories for this iconic character, because look who they have to lead after.
Yeah,
So,
sure.
I think they're intimidated.
Well, I think that, you know, I think there was a lot of creators who thought, hey, this strip that's appearing in this black and white comic in the UK, I can take those ideas and put them into my US published comic, and no one will know it's me. Like, no one know I've taken this idea from somewhere else.
But
And as Chris has pointed out, a lot of Alan's ideas had already come from, Alan is like, I think we all are. I won't say Alan is. I think we all are sponges. We all take in things.
Of course.
We filter things out. Every idea we have is literally, it's whether it's conscious or subconscious. We filtered out a bunch of ideas, merged a few things, and suddenly out pops a new idea, and like, oh wow, yeah, this is really cool. You talk to somebody else, and they're going like, oh, that sounds just like such and such. And so,
Yep. There's always an initial seed somewhere.
there always is.
But on the other hand, there's always this idea. There is a tough act to follow. But a good example for me is Animal Man. And did the mic drop on that book? And when the New 52 started, everybody said, "Oh, New 52, horrible." There was some very good books, and if you look at Jeff Lemire's and Terrell Foreman's Animal Man, for the first issue, he actually did an Alan Moore. He completely redesigned the character from the ground up, and it's fantastic. It's really fantastic.
Yeah. But I think, it's. I think that I personally would like to see creators stop trying to just outdo other creators and just focus on really good stories and with good, interesting human characters, and just bring me in. I mean, it's, I like I like to see characters that sort of, I feel like, you slowly get to like, you slowly care for, and then you start messing with them, and then you feel for them, you care for them. It's difficult to read a comic from issue one and start feeling like you care for someone on the first issue.
What I would also like is the idea of creators working together, because basically, I mentioned this before, this is so unique. I've never seen that before. When you go back to Zatanna, there's several interesting things. First of all, what's so interesting is that Conway tied in text features into the story. There were not only comic stories, but there were text features tied into the story. It's one ongoing story, which he didn't get to finish, but he mapped it out in 3 acts. And it was Chris Claremont who continued, but you can really see he continued what Conway had established. He was not coming in and saying, well, basically, oh, forget all that, I do it completely different. He was following the original arc, and I find this very interesting. Today, you very often see a new writer coming in and say, okay, screw that guy, I do my own thing. But that's very often to the detriment of the story.
Well, often, and to be fair to some writers, that might be the case in some instances. In some instances, it's maybe a certain creator has started a book, and the editors all love the idea at the get-go, but the sales aren't there.
Yeah.
And so rather than work with that writer to maybe sort of like, hey, how can we do this? They just kick them off, bring another writer on, and editorially, the editors are telling him, right, go somewhere else now. Like, do something different now.
You saw that a lot in the New 52. It was really painful to watch.
Oh, it was very painful. I mean, I was as an agent, I was working with a couple of artists on a couple of those books, and like you'd see about turns.
Whole issues were discarded because all of a sudden there was some criticism, and NBC said, "No, we're stopping this. Discard the issue, throw it away. We do something else." Ridiculous.
Yeah, it was. I think there was literally one title out of the whole 52 that had a single creative team on every single, or at least artistically had the same artist.
Batman.
No, even that had fill-in artists.
No. Oh yeah, I think you're right. Yeah, there were fill-in artists. Who was
the only one was Voodoo. It had a different writer. It started out I think
Ron Martz did it, didn't he?
Ron Mars started it, and Joshua Williamson took over.
And it was horrible.
But there was two other writers before even Ron Mars. And the only consistent thing was the artist Sami Basri on the entire book, and the colorist, Jessica Coline. Those were the only two consistents of the whole book. But yeah, it was literally like you'd see the script. I'd get the script to give to the artists come in, and it had Superman in it, and then like literally like the following day I'd be like, don't send that to the artist or tell them to stop. We're taking Superman out. We're putting Green Lantern in instead.
Oh, geez.
Which meant a completely different rewrite because different powers, different. So.
All right. So look, it's been over an hour. We've been loving this topic. So Henry's over here.
It's endless. I mean, it's endless.
It is.
And as we've said, I think going from the examples from both, all three of us, you can tell that it's complex. It's
too complex.
Sometimes like on independent books, often it's a writer who he's paying the artist to draw his scripts. So he may, like straight from the get-go, he wants it to be his, so he gets sole created by credit. And even though the artist may have come up with designs, because he's being paid by the writer gets to keep the copyright.
Nah, man, I would give a percentage still. I mean, that's something that should happen. If you're a writer, you should want to give at least a little piece to somebody that's helped you to visualize.
Well, I've done that. I've done that myself in all the books and stories I've written.
Because you're a good person, Dave.
I've paid the artists for the work they've done for me, but they still own a piece of it. So if it goes anywhere else, they will always own a piece of it. So,
dude, if people would like that, then this wouldn't even be a topic. But unfortunately, because there's a lot of people that don't like this, along with the corporations, and there's just some creators that have egos and say, "Nah, this is my shit." That exists.
Well, it does, and I think a lot of it stems from because particularly when Marvel, in particular, first started to get the movies off the ground, and creators of some of those characters weren't being compensated in any way. That was when they were like, hold on a second. I never signed you a contract. Like there was things like where Marvel actually had printed on the back of its checks by cashing, there was a line that about cashing this check meant that you were basically doing work for hire.
Wow.
It goes beyond the world of fiction. I mean, there's this interesting story about the Barbie doll, because the Barbie doll was originally an idea from Germany. There was the Lily doll, and this couple who was working for Mattel, they came to Germany and saw this doll was basically a prostitute doll, which they said, well, basically we make it into a wholesome American doll. And the Lily doll was based on a sexy cartoon series that ran in a local tabloid, and everybody wanted that doll.
You're telling me Barbie has a history in naughtiness? Oh my God.
In CD Germany, imagine this.
Oh my God.
The couple who saw this, they said, we'll basically make this kind of doll, but for the American market as a wholesome doll. And they went. The woman was the CEO of Mattel at that time, and she said, "Well, basically, we bring this designer in, and he had this idea. He said, well, a doll is fine, but I have this idea. I create a complete world around her, and she has changing outfits and all of that. That was all his idea. And Mattel gave him 5% of all the sales.
5%.
And once that thing really took off, and he was really living it." Mattel said, well, basically, this contract might not be right. And they tried to sue him out of the contract.
Fuck that.
They won eventually.
What?
Actually.
Yes. They did?
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
See, but that's just...
that's not right.
So, all right. So I'll give you an example. And this is, unfortunately, it's a very personal one that I was on the very rough end of. I basically come up with a concept for a line of books, a publishing company, working with someone who was incredibly wealthy, but it wasn't something that he was remotely interested in. He had so many other way bigger irons in the fire to deal with. So he agreed to fund it. So I started work on it. As each of those irons in the fire he had went cold, and he lost money on all of them, he decided, well, everybody seems to love what you're doing, Dave, so I'm actually going to spend more time working on this with you. And then eventually it was like, I think it'd be a really good idea, because a lot of people know who I am. I think we should say that I'm the creator of it.
Wow.
And then, you know, and because he was so wealthy, I never thought it was stupid of me. I actually thought, well, he's got so much money. He's had so much fame. He's not going to screw me. Lo and behold, he screwed me, because money was no object to him. But however, credit, and he had nothing else going for him. He decided he wanted his name on this. He wanted to take my credit for writing I'd done on it.
What?
Yep.
Fuck that. Bullshit.
And then he decided, I don't really need you anymore, because I can find someone cheaper. And basically, I'd been promised an equity deal. And he then said to me, he said, like, well, you know how much money I've got? Sue me. And he actually said, I will enjoy draining every single cent you've got and see you go nowhere with this lawsuit.
You know what? Not for nothing, Dave, but I'm so 90s that you talk to me like that. Okay, I'm gonna fuck you up. You understand me? I'm gonna just swing. The moment you talk to me like that, I'm hitting you.
Often easier said than done.
Yeah.
No, honestly, I jumped the gun. I'm an emotional Puerto Rican, bro. I will fuck you up. You talk to me like that.
You unfortunately, you can't hit someone over email. So
no. But there's also, I mean, this really sucks.
That's the pussy shit.
But let's also have a good example, a positive example here, because which is also again in my column. The reason why we remember, do you know the reason why we still remember H.P. Lovecraft? Because H.P. Lovecraft, he was a failed writer. He died broke in 1937.
He was a racist writer, but
he was also a racist. Also
the unnameable reanimator, and you know, he created a lot of crazy shit, man.
Yeah, but hang on. I address that too in my column. In a way, it makes sense. But let's talk about the positive example. He was completely forgotten. The readers who read science didn't like his stuff, but he had two friends who were willing to go with his stories. And one guy had money. This is the money example again. And they founded Arkham House exclusively to republish his books or his short stories. And they put out a volume in 1939 of his short stories, and it sold 100 copies. And over time, they invested money to make Lovecraft happen. And it didn't go nowhere. And then, even then, they said, well, basically, the Americans don't like this. Let's translate this and bring it to Europe. 20 years later, when it came to France, the French said, well, this is the shit. This is the best we've ever seen. And once it became a hit in France, the Americans said, oh, who is this cool writer? So over 20 years, they invested money to make Lovecraft happen. And eventually they did. Isn't that interesting?
Yeah. Also the, it was kind of it was an unofficial shared universe, wasn't it?
Yeah, they had other writers, because there's only 20 short stories or something by Lovecraft. There's not so much material. So once they had a franchise, they expanded on it, of course.
Oh no, I was thinking about the Robert E. Howard stories.
It's also true, but they had other writers later write in the Lovecraft world. So the idea of expanding on an existing property is nothing new.
You see, Lovecraft is touchy. He was a racist pig, but damn, bro, he was a creative horror master. Fuck. And I'm a horror fan, so it's like I'm always torn between that. I appreciate the works and try to bypass
So
that nature
there's
because I try to understand that that was the time and that's how it was. No excuse, but that's how shit was then.
Well,
I think
And
I think with Lovecraft there's something many people do not know. Lovecraft was an anti-Semite who was married to a Jew. So things are not as black and white as we make them
of
out
course
today.
not, but the language used in certain books with the N word consistently. I mean,
Well,
I
that
read
was
a lot of his works. I mean,
yeah,
he
but that
was
was
pretty fucked up.
yeah, but that was definitely the time.
Yeah, again, see, that's what I'm saying. So people sometimes get torn between that, not trying to understand the time, because we're living in a time where cancel culture exists, and they want to look at the past, but not be educated enough about it to understand things that were going on then and why it was the past, as opposed to now that maybe we're just becoming better human beings. No
I mean,
problem, whatever.
yeah, I mean, Robert E. Howard wasn't much different.
No, he
Exactly.
wasn't. He was just as bad, and yet I fucking love Conan. You know what I
But
mean?
Yeah.
but you know, look, I mean, you know, it's even if you look at the world today, you know, again, all right, I'm not going to go political here, but like, you know, our current president has a hardcore following of about 60 million people. And you know, you've got to share some of the things that he believes in to be a follower. So yeah, you know, I wish the world had changed more, but it hasn't. So
No, it hasn't changed at all. We keep having the same arguments we've had for numerous decades and even centuries. So hopefully one day things will get better. Maybe it's gonna take the aliens coming down for us to unite as humanity and be like, all right, humans versus aliens now. Now all of a sudden we're one, as we should always be anyway. So guys, any closing thoughts on the created by? Because we've come to no determination here. It's just so difficult because his story is so unique and how things worked out.
well, you can. I think.
Go ahead.
Go on, Chris.
No, I was just wanted to say, if you are a creator out there, make sure you get the proper credit if you can, and if you work with a partner who puts in work, give him or her proper credit.
I think that it's that thing of it's very different if you know, if it's you, like a couple of people getting together and creating their own thing that they own and they're going to self-publish, or they go through an image or someone like that and it's going to be creator owned. It's usually a lot easier to deal with. It's a different politics, but I would say take care of it up front. Like as soon as before that first comic appears, make sure you've worked out exactly who's in control, who signs off on it. If you do get interest, like I know it's very rare, but occasionally, you know, it does happen. You get film offers, TV offers. Well, make sure that you're both in agreement on exactly who gets to sign off, on who gets to agree, who's the consultant, like, you know, because too often it's the writer that becomes the person who's the liaison with Hollywood, who ends up as, oh, I'm going to get to write an episode. You know, make sure you've got all of that worked out beforehand. Have that discussion, because otherwise it's hardship later. It's tough. It's a tough conversation to have once you've let the comic or your project out the gate.
Once the cat's out the bag, bro, you're kind of gonna get screwed.
But with corporations, you just have to remember that once you're, you know, if you get that chance to work on Batman or Spider-Man, you are not a creator. You might create a new character, but it's up to them to do with that character what they will. You might get credit for creating that character.
Yes.
And you may even get some sort of financial compensation for that character if it goes somewhere beyond the comic.
I think nowadays that should be a standard. If this navigates toward this, we'll give you a bonus of this.
Right.
Come on, yo.
But it's not yours to control. Remember that.
Yeah. Definitely. Listen, when you're paid work for hire, you know what you're getting into.
Mm.
This is why creator owned has been so hot lately. You know, people have figured out, why should I give this up?
Yeah. But remember, like you brought up the great example of Bob Layton.
Yeah, man, that shit
He
pissed
was
me off, boy.
no, but there's no doubt he was a contributor
Contributor.
to the
Yes,
Iron Man mythology.
yes,
Like
yes. But don't
Definitely.
don't tell me created by. Don't put that shit on your banner, because
no,
no,
look,
no, no.
they may have used a couple of his Iron Man designs or rough as templates for some of the
He's
designs.
a contributor, not a
But you're a contributor.
a
You're
co-creator.
yeah,
If you want to be something, co-creator, not
yeah,
a
you're
creator. No.
exactly your percentage of what you contribute to a universe, because you're creating to a universe, you're adding things onto it,
Mm-hmm.
you're building on a foundation that already exists. As yeah, it's like you are a creator on the Iron Man book, but you
Hmm.
are not the creator of the Iron Man book.
Exactly.
And
Exactly.
and
My
any
argument. Let me tell you, Dave. I had a world-class creator next to me that I grabbed by the shoulder. I'm not gonna mention his name because he was like, "Al, don't do it, bro." But I had to. I tweeted it that day. I grabbed him by the shoulder. I said, "What does that say up there, bro?" And he goes, "Created by." I said, "What do you think about that?" And he just smirked. He goes, "Al, don't do it." He saw me take a picture, and I shared it that day because I felt the type of way. I was like, I mean, yes, you're good, but don't take that type of credit. You know what I mean? Relax.
but look, I mean, when and I hate to put it in this context, but how long ago did Bob Layton work on Iron Man, and for how long? I mean, it might have to him felt like I mean, he might have worked on it for like 5, 6 years,
You know?
but out of 70 years, 60 years, 60 years of Iron Man,
It's just a blip.
it's
Hmm.
yeah. I mean, his contribution at that time was great. Um, but so
Agreed.
was the
No, I'm
so
not
was
taking away the
yeah. No, I'm not.
creativity.
I'm
It's
not
just
trying
that
to. But
label, the label, man.
it's you have to be honest with yourself about what to label yourself as.
Yes. And that's what that's about here, folks. The created by.
Mm,
Like,
yeah,
really think about this, write it down. But if you're a writer and you have an artist that works with you to help create your vision, y'all both creators there. Give
yeah.
credit where credit due, man. For real.
Well, that's the important part. Credit where credit's
Exactly.
due.
Exactly.
Yes.
You know.
Absolutely.
That's the bottom line of this whole conversation, or hopefully, hope you guys kind of thought about this. Look at all these examples we laid out. Kind of silly, right? If you think about it, like, people just don't want to share credit. Oh, or ego. Put the ego to the side and just create and give us stuff that we could enjoy. At the end of the day, that's all I want. I don't want all the drama, and I want everybody to get the credit that they deserve. No?
Yeah.
And there we go,
Definitely.
folks. This has been an awesome International Comics Crusaders weapon. So, guys, I know you teased us with a guest, Dave. I won't say nothing yet until that's locked down firmly.
Hmm.
But I know you're working on some good stuff for us. And Chris, I can't wait for that column. You teased me too much today. These Germans are freaks. They just like teasing, I swear.
No,
And
it's just Chris.
it's
That's
just Chris. He's there with his noir style cigarette and teasing columns. He's the new Alfred Hitchcock. Forget about it. Now,
Hmm.
with that, folks, please check out undercovercapes.com today, because Johnny Hughes has the new Outside the Panels with Rafael Albuquerque.
oh
Great
Hey,
guest.
excellent.
Check that out. We're gonna have a new Real Romance tomorrow. This Wednesday, we're gonna have a new Definitive Crusade alongside Chris's column, of course. We got great stuff going on, folks. Make sure to check us out. ComicCrusaders.com, UndercoverCapes.com. I'm the real Almega with D Valiant and Mr. @Views_Chris. Hasta la próxima, mi
Adios.
gente. Stay safe. Much love. And with that, wepa!